Hello, one and all, and welcome back. Today is April 13th, 2022, and this is the fourth episode of the Fulfilling Reign studies. As I mentioned before in the other episodes, the title of this series is The Giants of Antiquity. So previously we've gone over after the introduction, our second episode was Genesis Giants, taking us from Adam and Eve through the days of Jared and Enoch, up through the flood of Noah. And then we kind of recapped the next episode about Sodom and Gomorrah. And then that episode was about Joseph's time in Egypt, and the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan. So we're already familiar with the fact that there were giants inhabiting the land of Canaan when the Israelites came there, and God had to force them out or wipe them out. So today we're going to be talking about, are there any left? And what happened to the ones who didn't die? Okay, so briefly talking about that. All over the world, there is a plethora of evidence that the Phoenicians, which was the Greek name for the Canaanites, traveled all over the world. In fact, in Sardinia, there was a stele, a stone with an inscription on it that said, "We are they who fled from the face of Joshua the robber, son of Nun." So when Joshua, who took over Moses' task of leading the Israelites into the land of Canaan, into the promised land, those Canaanite tribes and other tribes with giants fled to other areas. Some of them fled because they saw what was happening to their brethren and said, we better get out while we still have a chance. And so we've got Canaanite origins for the people who inhabited Sardinia in those days. And you can tell by the culture and practices, artwork, and this sort of thing. And if you want to do that research for yourself, there is no shortage of information on it, I promise. We don't have time to go through all of that today, but it's a very interesting subject. But we've got Canaanite origins even so far as here in the Americas. There was another rock, another stele, that was found in the Ohio River Valley in basically what was a bunch of Native American artifacts, and it was a time when Cahokia, which was the Mississippian capital, basically, of North America, about, I want to say, 10,000 years ago. But it may, in fact, have been a little bit younger, a little bit older than that. But about the time of the Roman Empire, so about 2,000 years ago, 2,000 plus years ago is when some of the artifacts that I have date to. But older than that, there were still civilizations here in the Americas. And this one particular stele was recently translated, and it said to Baal of the Canaanites in dedication. So we know that there were Canaanites so far as North America, but all over the Mediterranean and the Levant and further out towards Asia and even in the Pacific Islands. The Phoenicians were a mighty seafaring people. They knew how to ride the currents, and they could circumnavigate the globe. And I believe they did, in fact, circumnavigate the globe. So we have some tribes of Canaanites who did flee from Joshua during the conquest of Canaan, but we had some that stayed. So those are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be talking about David and Goliath and the other tribes of giants that inhabited Canaan. So again, I'm going to post these on the screen. Today's video should be a good bit shorter than the other two that we've had before, which were about between 40 and 45 minutes. This one should be shorter. So I'll post these scripture verses up on the screen, and you can read along with me. If you have your Bible, please turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Okay, we're going to be reading from verses 4 through 11 to start out with. Okay, and this is what it says. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Okay, so let's talk about this one real quick. So we've got the Philistine army, okay, and they have come out for battle at Gath. This particular place where they're having their battle at is called the Valley of Elah. And I've driven past it. I've driven through it when I was in Israel about 4 years ago. I guess 5 now. But this valley, it's very interesting. There is the acoustics of this valley are very good, and there is someone on YouTube. In fact, Sergio and Rhoda in Israel. If you haven't heard of them, check them out. Subscribe to them. It's very good. They go to all these places around Israel, and they check out historical sites, archaeological sites, and they investigate the scriptures that took place there. They've actually been to this Valley of Elah, the site where the battle took place, and you can actually see where the Israelites would have encamped and the Philistines would have encamped across the valley. You can see each other, you can see troops moving about, this and that. Okay, the valley is expansive, but if you stand in the middle of the valley and you shout, you can audibly hear every word of what's being said. The acoustics are really great. And this couple, Sergio and Rhoda, tested this out, and it did work. So there is no doubt that if you had a champion, especially a giant, down in that valley, shouting up at the Israeli encampment on the other side, you can clearly hear what is being said. Okay, so the next thing that we hear about is all of these statistics about his weapons and armor, speaking of Goliath. Okay, so a helmet of bronze on his head, okay, and armed with a coat of mail, most likely bronze as well. He also had a javelin or a spear of bronze, and the shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam. I'm going to put up a picture of a weaver's beam up there. It's the top bar of the weaver's device that holds all of the strings that are going down. So it's the beginning of the tapestry. So it's the beam that holds all the weight. So it needs to be heavy, it needs to be thick, and to be able to hold all the weight of that tapestry. Okay, so the shaft was like a weaver's beam. The spear head alone weighed 600 shekels of iron. Okay, let me just get out this little note right here, because I wrote this down. So 1 shekel, when we're talking about shekels, today a shekel is a form of currency. I actually have shekels at home that I brought back from Israel, but a shekel then is talking about a weight measurement. So this is not a coin or a currency, but it's a weight measurement. So 1 shekel was about 0.445 ounces or 12.9 grams. Okay, so the spearhead alone, using conservative numbers, the spearhead alone was 16 pounds 11 ounces. That's enormous. That is enormous. And we're talking bronze. We're not talking iron. We're talking bronze. So bronze is a little bit lighter than iron or steel, things of this nature. And still it's weighing 16 pounds, 11 ounces. And that's just the head of the spear that goes on that weaver's beam of a shaft we're talking about. Okay, the armor. Let's talk about the armor. Okay. The weight of the coat of mail was 5,000 shekels of bronze. So the spearhead was 600 shekels, and the coat of mail is 5,000 shekels of bronze, which means approximately, again, using conservative numbers, that coat of mail that Goliath wore was approximately 125 pounds. That's a whole young person that you're wearing. That's heavy armor. So there's no doubt that we're talking about a very large man. With that being said, let's talk about the height. 6 cubits and a span. Now there's the common cubit, there's the royal cubit. Cubit normally, if it's measured, is a little longer than from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. So it's probably about here. Okay, so 6 cubits in a span. Goliath was about 9 feet and 6 inches tall. 9 feet, 6 inches. Okay, a span was about like that. A span would have been, if you measured from your pinky to the tip of your thumb. And obviously different people are going to have different hands, but a span was, about like that. So, roughly a third of a cubit, around there. But yeah, so Goliath was about 9 feet 6 inches tall. That's a tall dude. And you've got to remember, these giants, they're not just tall, they're broad. So these are not people who suffer from gigantism. These are people who, in their genetics, are bred to be giant and to be warriors and fierce and big. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a man 9 foot 6 inches with armor that weighs 125 pounds, with a spear like a weaver's beam and a spearhead weighing 16 pounds, okay, shouting at you across a valley and challenging any one of your soldiers to come down. That's frightening. Got my morning mug. All right. So the next part we're going to read, okay, it's still in 1 Samuel, chapter 17. This is going down to verse 40, okay? This is what it says. Then he, David, took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Okay, this is an important point. You might not think so, and you might read over it and just think, okay, he got some stones, put them in his pouch. Okay, so 2 things that we know from this. David was a shepherd. 2, he's out in these fields near where this war is taking place. So why does he choose 5 stones? We're going to get to that in a minute. But remember, Goliath's not the only giant in Gath. Okay? David chooses 5 stones. Okay? So he's a shepherd. He chooses 5 stones. He goes out. Okay, now moving on down, okay, to verse 48 and 49. Here's what that says. When the Philistine arose and came near when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he, Goliath, fell on his face to the ground. So you've got a shepherd boy who takes his sling. He chooses not to take the armor and the weapons that Saul gives him, but he's not used to those. He says, I haven't tested them. I am good with the sling, and I've killed lions and I've killed bears. So I know that my aim is accurate with this. I'm going to use this. And he brings down this giant with a simple stone. Okay, then what happens? Here's what happens. Okay, going down to verse 51. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. Now it says he took his sword out of his sheath. He's talking about Goliath's sword. So Goliath had a spear, but he also had a sword. This sword, I mean, imagine if the spear is that big, imagine how big this sword is. So David takes out his sword, cuts off the head of Goliath, and the Philistines flee, seeing that their champion is defeated. So, of course, they don't keep their end of the bargain. They're not servants to Israel. They just run. They scatter, And so David, a shepherd boy, has conquered the giant. And now he has instilled courage in the hearts of all of Israel and has won a great victory and also respect and admiration in the eyes of King Saul. Okay. Now, here's something interesting. What does he do with the head? Okay, 1 Samuel 17, moving down to verse 54. It reads this: And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So he takes Goliath's armor, don't know what he's going to do with it, maybe melt it down, puts Goliath's armor in his tent, but Goliath's head, he takes it back to Jerusalem. He holds it up in front of the people and he says, the enemy of Israel is defeated, and presumably throws it out, for the crowd to celebrate and everything. So here's something to think about. When Jesus was crucified, where did they take him? They took him to a place outside the city called Golgotha. In some cases we call it Calvary, but in Hebrew it's Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Whose skull? There's some people that think that this mountain, this hill that Jesus was crucified on looked like a skull, or resembled the bald skull cap, that sort of thing. And there is, in fact, a place in Israel, one of the many sites that are attested to be the place of the crucifixion. And it does look like a skull, actually. It looks like two eye sockets and a nasal passage here, and the bottom's kind of eroded out. But it does look like a skull, and I've got pictures of it. But I would suggest this. Golgotha, the place of the skull. But you've also got Goliath of Gath. It could be that this is a tweaking of Golgotha, Goliath of Gath, and it's actually the place where Goliath's skull is buried. Which means, and think about this, as David won his victory over Goliath and crushed the head of his enemy, that Jesus, when he is crucified on the cross on Golgotha, he is literally winning the eternal victory over the place where Goliath's skull is buried, over the head of his enemy, which we know is the adversary, Satan. So Jesus is symbolically crushing the head, and of course, in the spirit realm, literally crushing the head of his enemy. So I think that Golgotha could be a reference to the place of Goliath's skull, where Goliath's skull was buried after it was brought back to Jerusalem. Because it couldn't be buried within the city. it would have had to have been buried outside the city, and this is exactly where Jesus would have been led to be crucified, is outside the city walls, because it would have been unclean for dead people to be inside the city walls, because the Jewish people couldn't be near dead bodies. It would make them unclean. So just something to think about. Little interesting tidbit. Okay, now moving down to verse 58 of 1 Samuel 17. It says this, "And Saul said to him, 'Whose son are you, young man?' And David answered, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.'" So we've got David, the son of Jesse, and Jesse is from the town of Bethlehem, the same place that Jesus was born. Coincidence? No, I don't believe in coincidences. I'm not a coincidence theorist, okay? Now we're going to come back to that in just a minute. Okay, we're going to move on to 2 Samuel. Okay, so turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 21. Okay, and this is verse 15 through 22. Now we're going to talk about the other giants. So David's won his victory, he becomes king, and then there's more war with the Philistines. The Philistines. So this is what it says. Okay, 2 Samuel 21, starting with verse 15. "There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines. And David grew weary. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, 'You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel.' After this there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Soph, or in some translations it's translated as Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants. And there was war again with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jara-Oragim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." Okay, so here we get 4 more giants. There's Ishbi-Benob. Okay, there's a second Goliath, Goliath the Gittite. There's Soph, or in some pronunciations, Sippai. And then there's a 4th giant who goes unnamed, but we learn something interesting about him. He has 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that this was actually quite common among the giant tribes in Israel to have this polydactyly, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. 6 in Hebrew is the number of man. So if we're talking 6, we're, especially if you're talking about the mark of the beast, 3 6s in succession, talking about the number of man in a trinity instead of the number of God in a trinity. And the number of God, 7 signifies, completion. It also represents the 7-fold Spirit of God. There are many different meanings for 7, and 6. But if you read into Native American history here in the United States, in the American Southwest, there were actually tribes such as the Hopi, the Zuni, and before them the Anasazi. The Anasazi have disappeared, and that's a story for another time about what happened to the Anasazi tribe. But there are petroglyphs in that area, and there are many petroglyphs, and I'll put a picture up here, of 6-fingered handprints, 6-toed footprints, and petroglyphs of giants towering above humans. And there are many Native American legends of races of giants here in the Americas. There was a red-haired race of giants and a dark-haired race of giants. They had 6 fingers on the hand, 6 toes on the foot. They were exceedingly tall, and they were cannibals. And so something interesting to look into. There's, as I said before, there's no shortage of information out there about this stuff. So if your interest is piqued by what you're hearing here, check it out, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's in a book, whether it's on a podcast. There is no shortage of information about this, about the giants, about the Nephilim, about the Native American legends of giants, and archaeological evidence all over the world supporting the giants. Okay, but let's move forward, okay? Let's move to 1 Chronicles, because there was something there that caught my attention. We get, this 4th giant that's unnamed, but we seem to get a 5th giant as well. Okay, 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5. This is what it says. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair struck down Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who the shaft of whose spear was like that of a weaver's beam. So we get this other named giant, Lami. Okay, so it could be that Lami was the unknown giant, but seeing as further down in 1 Chronicles, it talks about the 6-fingered giant as well. So it could be that this is just a completely new giant, or that it is a different translation of one of those names. That Goliath the Gittite and maybe Lami, since they were related, Lami just wasn't named. But anyways, we get Goliath of Gath, who David killed. And then we get Ishbi-Benob, we get Soph or Sippai, we get Goliath the Gittite, and then we have either Lami and the 6-fingered man, the 6-fingered giant. 5. Okay, maybe 6, including Lami. But I'm sorry, I'm having trouble talking today. Mainly, we're talking 5 giants. So, 5 giants, 5 stones from the river that David picked up. Okay, this is interesting, right? And David was living in that area and shepherding his sheep, so it's no surprise that David probably was observing what was going on across the lines of battle and noticed that there were 5 men of great stature and perhaps prepared 5 stones from his sling. There's one more thing that I want to talk about, and then we'll end the video. I want you to read with me Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. Okay? Here's what Isaiah chapter 11 says. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Remember what we talked about when we talked about the punishment of the serpent in the Garden of Eden? I will instill iniquity enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. Okay, so we're talking about the seed of the serpent, lowercase and uppercase. So there's the seed of the serpent, which is lowercase, the Nephilim, the giants, born of the unholy union of the fallen Watcher, divine beings, and human women, creating the offspring race of giants. And then we've got the uppercase seed of the serpent, which is the man of sin, the Antichrist. Then we've got the seed of the woman, lowercase, which is humanity in general, but maybe certain humans, perhaps David. And then the seed of the woman, uppercase, meaning Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God. So what's interesting to note here is that David is a foreshadowing of who Christ will be. He's just, on a lesser scale. David is from Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. He's of the branch of Jesse. Okay? He becomes a king. He strikes down the enemy of Israel. Okay? And then we have Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem. He's of the branch of Jesse and of the branch of David. Okay? He is a shepherd, like David. He's a king. Except, unlike David, he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and king of a realm unseen by human eyes, and an eternal king. His reign will not end. And he smites the enemy of humanity, and in doing so, the enemy of Israel. So we've got this correlation between David and Jesus. Jesus is the perfected form of that branch of Jesse. So when we're talking about the giants, we're talking about David and Goliath, and not just them, but all of the giants. David, by slaying Goliath, gave his people the courage to go up against giants. And you'll see all of his people throughout David's time and his war with the Philistines and the other tribes, is that now that he has slain Goliath, his people have no problem running up to giants and killing them. This courage is the same courage that God gives us to go up against the enemy. And he arms us with the armor of God, the sword of the Spirit, the helmet of salvation, the full armor of God. Jesus gives to us through his Holy Spirit and through his holy word, and we are able to slay giants just as David did. So this concludes this episode. The next episode, we're going to be moving into the New Testament. So we're going to talk a little bit about Jesus and the miracles and the casting out of demons, especially the Gadarene, which is a very interesting one and points back to something that was mentioned in the book of Enoch. But that is all the time that I will allot for that today. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I'm sorry for all the language faux pas and fumbles and whatnot. We'll get through it. But anyways, I hope that you join us in the next couple of days whenever I record that video, and we will see you then. God bless every last one of you. Have an amazing week. Bye-bye.